All right. Hello, everyone. I think that's that over. Welcome to this Ubuntu One live stream. My name is Reese Davis. I am a developer advocate at Canonical, and today we'll be talking about Raspberry Pi, and we'll be talking to a couple of the engineers behind the Ubuntu support for Raspberry Pi. So this should be, hopefully it'll be a little bit interesting, a little bit exciting. We'll talk about the past, the present, and some of the plans we have for the future. Before we get into all of that stuff, I'll let the gentlemen here introduce themselves. Dave, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dave Jones, also known as Waveform80 on Twitter and Waveform on various places like Freenode and Libera nowadays. I'm the engineer responsible for Ubuntu on the Pi at the Pi Foundation, not the Pi Foundation, the Ubuntu Foundations team. Very confusing, these things. So I'm the guy that coordinates what we try and get into each release and try and prioritize the bug fixes that we make for each release. I've been on that. My first release was Disco. I think I came on about a month before Disco, so I didn't actually do much on it other than watch and stare and go, oh, this is how things work. But I've been there since through Focal, Groovy, Suit, and so on. I'll be there for Impish 2.
Awesome.
I'm William Wilson. I'm John Smith, just about everywhere else. Freenode, Twitter, all the things. I'm the new kid on the block, Pi-wise, or really Ubuntu-wise. I came on at the very beginning of the year, so Pursuit Hippo was my first release. Looking forward to my first long-term support release, which will be whatever JJ is. So I live in Dallas, grew up in Philly, and I just always been obsessed with Raspberry Pis, and now I get to work with them, which is really exciting.
Which is pretty great. Cool. And you both are on the Foundations team, which Dave mentioned there, but maybe so there's no confusion between Raspberry Pi Foundation and foundations like Dave's confusion. Maybe you want to, William, can you tell everyone what the Foundations team is and what you guys do?
Yeah, sure. So there are a whole bunch of different types of Ubuntu. There's the server edition, there's the desktop edition, and we at the Foundations team, we try to handle things that are common between those different types. So things like networking we handle, things like the boot process we handle. Big exception there is we don't do the kernel.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we just try to basically,
compile,
as the name implies, we are the foundations for all the different types of Ubuntu. Is that a good enough explanation, Dave? Considering I've been here like 6 months.
That is pretty much what Foundations do. I should probably also mention, prior to Ubuntu, I've been involved in various Pi libraries. So if anybody knows PyCamera and PySense and PyCraft and Can You Spot a Theme Yet? Those are variously mine. And I've had a small hand in things like GPIO 0 and PyWheels and that sort of thing. And I still do. Foundations team is exactly what William described. Probably better than I could have.
Cool. And so we'll be talking about all things Pi in the future, the past, the present, and the future, and all these kind of things. But just quickly before that, I see there's a comment from Ben already. When is GPIO 02 coming out?
Do you not know, Ben? It's your project.
Okay. So the first thing we want to talk about was sort of the history of Ubuntu on the Raspberry Pi. So I'll give a little bit of background, a little bit of context, and I'll hand over to Dave because you've been here longer than I have. But actually, before I do that, I just want to qualify this with we've all got our Ubuntu community hats on here. We're not wearing our Canonical hats, so everything we say here is as Ubuntu community member and contributing to Ubuntu, not everything we say here isn't necessarily what Canonical is saying or Canonical is doing, but it's just our opinions and what we think about Raspberry Pi because we're all, the three of us are very are Pi guys, right? So let me go. Let me say a little bit of background. So Ubuntu has had some form of Raspberry Pi support for a long time. You've been able to get it working, or you've been able to do some things with it for a long time. But a couple of years ago is when we started getting a little bit more serious about it. Before then, it was very similar to any other sort of cloud type thing that Ubuntu ran on. And then with which release was it, Dave? Which release was it that it became in?
So I came in on the Disco release. Prior to that, I think we've had Ubuntu releases going as far back as Xenial on the Pi.
Mhm.
So there was a 1604, but I've never had anything to do with those, or for that matter, anything up to Bionic. So Bionic's the earliest release that I've ever touched anything on. As far as Ubuntu on the Pi support went before that, it was treated very much like any other cloud platform, or much like any other single board computer, in as much as a release was made by taking an existing cloud image on a standard cloud basis and tweaking the bootloader so that it would boot Ubuntu. And that was about it, not much else in terms of customization. But the Pi is in many, many ways a special snowflake and does require quite a lot of customization. And is worth the customization as well, given the size of the community around it. So I think by the time Disco rolled around, they realized that they needed some dedicated headcount to deal with that particular platform. And I was working on the landscape team at the time and was drafted into the foundations team to say, you know about Pi stuff, don't you? You can do this. I said, I don't know the first thing about releasing stuff, but hey, okay, I'll give it a crack. And yeah, as I say, Disco came out shortly afterwards. I didn't have much to do with the Disco release other than watching other people and going, ooh. I had a bit more to do in the Owen release, and then Focal was the first release that I did a serious amount of work on. Though I still, on Focal, we didn't do a huge amount that was risky for the simple reason that it was an LTS release. We wanted to make sure that was something that could reliably be supported for 10 years. The whole point of releasing Pi-specific images was giving them exactly the same support cycle as the regular PC images. So you've got the same old free 5-year support on the LTS releases with the option of 5 years extension paid on ESM and so on. But that means that whatever we put in, we have to be prepared to support for 10 years, which is
a while. So
that's a long time.
aside from the work that you've done at Canonical for Ubuntu running Raspberry Pi, what were you doing Pi-wise, maybe before Canonical, before the Launchpad thing, or sort of otherwise, spare time-wise, community-wise?
So Ben will know a lot of this.
Don't go on too long, because I know you've got a long list.
Yeah. Ben will know all of this, because Ben is responsible for roping me into much of this. So I could reliably point the finger at him. Round about, I think it must have been 2013 or so, I was fascinated by this new Pi device that had come out. And a friend of mine who I knew from the Python Northwest group, the young Ben Nuttall, who is on the comments over there, sent me, I think, one of the camera modules that had just come out. And I looked at it and went, ooh, this is kind of funky, but there's no Python library. Well, I should probably write one. So I wrote one and released it, not really thinking anything more about it. I'd written a few open source things before then, but they were largely, yes, Les pointing the finger at Ben. Most of the open source I'd done before then was largely ignored. PyCamera wasn't ignored and was soon experiencing 1,000+ downloads a month, and I was going, I've got to support this now. It's grown quite a bit since then, and we've done a lot of work on it. Ben was instrumental in helping an awful lot with access to some of the firmware devs at the Pi Foundation where he wound up working, and that helped a great deal in figuring out how things operated at the low level with the camera. And then Ben started another project called GPIO 0, and I went, oh, I've got some ideas for that. And he roped me into doing large amounts on that. And then he started the Pi Wheels project and roped me into that. I should let him say no, but it's too much fun. Yes, there are many, many projects for which I could point the blame at Ben, but
for which you can point the blame at Ben, but everyone else can point some blame at you. So that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
That means there's something going on, right? Cool. And William, do you want to? What about you? When you joined, you said 6 months ago in January, I think it was. What have you done since then? And what have you done outside of Canonical, outside of Ubuntu stuff with the Raspberry Pi?
So for the Hirsute Hippo release, I helped out a lot. Well, I helped out a little, as much as I could with GPIO support, and then a little bit of hardware enablement for some of the newer models like the Pi 400. The GPIO work was a ton of fun. Just digging into that code, and I've used GPIOs a million times, and so being able to contribute to it was really fun. Outside of work, I've had Pis all over my house doing a variety of things for years and years. My security cameras are Raspberry Pis, which all the code for that is up on GitHub, which is one of the very few places I'm not John Smith. I am Glenn Pickle, which is a very obscure reference to a US TV show called The Office, which I know there's a British version. I know.
We don't talk about that much either.
So yeah, my security cameras, which is a system of 3 Pis. 2 of them are the actual cameras, and then 1 is a network video recorder. So all the files get dropped there in case of any tampering or anything like that. My home router is a Raspberry Pi. It's a Pi 4 with a USB 3 Ethernet adapter for the interface from the modem itself, and then the PoE hat with the switch that goes and runs DHCP services and gets me to the internet. So all of this traffic is currently traveling through a Raspberry Pi, at least one.
Now I feel another project coming on.
Well, yeah,
I can't claim the same, and now I'm jealous.
Wait, your house doesn't run on Raspberry Pis? But that's surprising.
Only partially, but not the router. No.
Not the router.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share configs, code, all that stuff. Other than that, yeah, I'm hosting some websites, some proximity chat for Among Us on Raspberry Pis. There's a whole little cluster of them that I'm trying to tame all the wiring for in my living room.
Nice. Okay, cool. And I'll say a quick thing about me, so I don't seem like a complete know nothing next to you guys. But I've been playing with Raspberry Pis and tinkering on Raspberry Pis for a long time as well. Throughout university, I was building little contraptions and little robots and things, just for fun and for my course, because I was mechatronic engineeringly trained. And then since then, I've put it to some similar type things. I've got just the camera bit, not the network bit. I need to poke around your GitHub there, William, to pick up on some of that stuff. But otherwise, it's just sort of things that sit behind the TV and collect things, media servers and Nextclouds and those kinds of things. But all of that is outside of Canonical stuff. With Canonical, I've been around since EON, and I've been working on Pi stuff since sometime into 2020, when we started talking to the Raspberry Pi Foundation and working with them a little bit more closely and having regular meetings and talking about these things, which is where the Ubuntu desktop came out of that collaboration for Raspberry Pi, which came with Groovy, which is actually what I've got on my shirt here. I'm just going to put that up there. There we go.
How come you've got a Groovy shirt? I haven't got a Groovy shirt.
It's not an official shirt. I can't claim that it is. Those shirts don't exist yet, or maybe they won't at all. It's custom made. Don't at me. But yeah, it was one of my proudest releases, so I thought I'd put it on the shirt. Cool. Okay, so that's a little bit of history about what we've been doing and a bit about Ubuntu on Raspberry Pi. I'll just re-mention here, because since there's some new people in the chat, if you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to put them in either Twitch or YouTube. We'll see both conversations coming from YouTube or from Twitch. But if you can, please head over to Twitch to chat to each other, because that's where you'll be able to see most people talking. But if you have any questions, we'll see them and we'll answer them as they come and go.
$99 for your t-shirt, no deal.
No deal at all. Okay, so let's talk. So next, we want to talk about a little bit about right here, right now, because this is the stuff that's going on. So a month or so ago now we announced sort of support for the GPIO on the Raspberry Pi. I was hoping, William, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, so maybe you can start talking about what the work that went into that and what that means right now for the state of things.
Yeah, sure. So with the new kernel, the way that the GPIOs are accessed is a little bit different. Dave can speak to the details on that a little bit better than I can, even though he's explained it to me like 4 times at least. He's still the expert there. But essentially, the old way of doing things was very hacky and bit bangy, and we're trying to gradually improve it and move on to ways that play a little bit nicer with the kernel. So there's a package called LGPIO, which enables usage of PWM, I2C, basic GPIO, high-low, SPI, maybe some other things that I'm forgetting, but it's a really nice library. It does things very pretty. So I actually made a bunch of examples of different scripts and stuff to use all those different protocols. I'm working on a project myself at the moment, which is an ugly mess of wires, yes, but it will be, these fans will go in my new Raspberry Pi stack that I'm making and try to keep everything cool. There's a little thermometer attached to it. And then the PWM fan, which is just a Noctua fan, will be controlled through LGPIO's PWM modules using the hardware PWM.
Actually, that's not hardware PWM, it's software PWM, but still.
You're right. Which is why I flinched as I said it. So I was like, wait.
Am I right?
Someone in the chat didn't call you out, though. Dave on the stream with you called you out, so that's good. Dave, you want to talk a little bit about the GPIO stuff as well? Then?
Sure. Things, as William says, things have changed a lot. There are a lot of changes coming with the GPIO. Historically, GPIO has been handled by banging on the GPIO registers, straight from user space, with whatever language you like, bypassing the kernel entirely. I mean, traditionally, the idea of having your kernel is that your kernel deals with the hardware, and you talk to the kernel to say, I would like to do this with the hardware, and the kernel says yay or nay and mediates all the access and handles people stepping on each other's toes and so on. But the kernel interfaces for GPIO were, shall we say, insufficient. Round about the time that the Pi was released, they were pretty basic, and they didn't include facilities for things like pull-ups and pull-downs, which are hugely useful if you're fiddling around with things on a breadboard and you want to connect a button straight to a GPIO. So without those things, the designers, the authors of various libraries decided the only realistic way to deal with this and to deal with it quickly enough was to just bang on the registers. So they just go to devmem as root and bang away at the GPIO registers in memory. Which works, sort of. It's not what you're meant to do with things, but needs must as the devil drives, and they did. And that worked for most things. It didn't work for event handling because the kernel absolutely wants to control those registers, and as soon as you start stepping on them, as we discovered with the native driver in GPIO 0, things crash. But that's okay, as you wind up with this sort of slightly schizophrenic routine of doing the right thing, going via the kernel for event handling, and doing the wrong thing for everything else. And that has worked, and is still working to this day with most of the libraries out there. So that's the way that RPiGPIO and PiGPIO and WiringPi and all the rest, this is how they still work. Right, Les has asked an excellent question in the chat. RPiGPIO is indeed the default means of accessing the GPIO on the Raspberry Pi. LGPIO is not a direct drop-in. There's several reasons for this. LGPIO is written by the same author as PiGPIO and is a sort of spiritual successor to it in a way, in that it plays with this new kernel interface that provides all the facilities that we do want, including pull-ups and pull-downs and so on for handling GPIO. Because of that, it follows the PiGPIO style rather than the LGPIO style. And that is a bit of a problem for anybody that's currently using RPiGPIO. For those, I don't have a good answer other than find another library, because RPiGPIO is not... there have been a couple of attempts to make a GPIO chip-based version of RPiGPIO, but none that work well that I have seen yet. GPIO 0 users, plug, nothing to do with it. GPIO 0 users shouldn't notice any difference for the simple reason that GPIO 0 doesn't do any driving of the pins itself. It sits on top of other libraries. And historically, it's always sat on top of RPiGPIO by default, but can sit on PiGPIO or a couple of other ones, including a native driver. For Ubuntu Suite, because we knew this kernel change was coming, this doesn't affect RaspBIOS yet, but for Ubuntu Suite, we knew that the kernel changes were coming, so we packaged up LGPIO and then added a module for GPIO 0 to sit on top of LGPIO by default. So if you use GPIO 0 on Hirsute, you should be going through LGPIO by default. Your script should still work because it's still just GPIO 0 at the end of the day. And hopefully you won't notice any differences. please. But do test it. Do let us know if there are any problems, because it should work, and we would very much like to know about these problems because these changes will be coming to Raspberry in the next release. Raspberry will be moving to a later kernel version. They will have to make certain changes as well. So it's vaguely important to check that these things do work now before they affect everything that you're doing.
The follow-up that Les had there is sort of relevant to the next thing I was going to ask, which is what you guys are sort of working on now, what the next thing that come out, the thing that'll happen will be, because he asked because it is a factor in being able to use hats add-ons with Ubuntu on the Raspberry Pi. So maybe, Dave, do you want to go ahead with that? What's next on the list?
The big push with Focal was basically to get basically get the boot sequence sorted out. The big push with Groovy.
With Focal?
That was with Focal. Then with Groovy, the big push was to get all the stuff on the Pi working, and most of that happened except for GPIO, which was super complicated, and that got pushed to Hirsute. So with Hirsute, we have pretty much everything on the Pi itself working. So now the push and impish is to get hats working. At the moment, we are lacking an awful lot of the hat libraries that Raspberry have. So most of the Pimoroni libraries for trying to think of one off the top of my head now, Explorer Hat, for example, where there is a Python library for that on Raspberry, we don't yet have that on Ubuntu. So the push this cycle is to get as many of these things as possible up to Debian, if I can, in which case it'll filter back down to Raspberry and Ubuntu. We're both downstream from Debian. And failing that, if that can't be done, then get them straight over to Ubuntu, where possible. So the big push this cycle is indeed to get hats working, and that will mean that if any of this comes up with having RPi GPIO as an interface there, we'll have to apply local patches to shift that over to LGPIO. Those patches will be sent upstream. Hopefully they will be acceptable. We'll have to see what happens with that. But yes, the big push this cycle is to get hats working, because that's an area where we're lacking around Ubuntu.
What hats are you shooting for first? I know we're shooting for the Sensat first because of popularity and so on. Yeah, but what hat would you want to see? What hat would you want specifically?
The Sensat is the biggie for me because it's the one I use most. I mean, I have a Sensat sat on my. It says trying to pull it off the cable. Yeah, so I have a little Sensat that sits on my desk, and that is the PyWheels monitor. That tells me the status of all the nodes in the PyWheels cluster. And yes, it's running on a battery, and it allows me to do funky little things like investigate what the various nodes are all up to. Changes. You probably can't see the colors or anything like that on this, but yeah, that is very, very useful for monitoring things. Sits in the corner of my desk. If everything turns red on there, I go, I better go and fix PyWheels quickly. Yeah, the Sensat is very good. Other than that, there are several Pimoroni hats which I know are quite widely used in education. The Explorer hat's probably the biggest one there. There's a few motor driver hats that will be very useful for robotics projects that I'd like to try and get in. There's some of the older ADC hats. I'm blanking on the name of them now, but yeah, there's a few of the hats with MCP 3008s and other ADCs on that would be very nice to get in. Most of those are relatively simple, I think. As Les has pointed out, there are some RPi GPIO issues there, but the ones like the ADCs, they're run over SPI, so no particular issue there. SPI is trivial to get working along with I2C. But GPIO stuff, yeah. Analog Zero, there you go. This has reminded me the Analog Zero. So yeah,
there you go. Cool. What about you? What hats would you want to see happen next that we can maybe start ferrying people at?
Definitely the Sensat, which is already prioritized. I've got a pipe dream project I'd like to see if I can get working with the Sensat, which is along with a whole bunch of other sensors, I'm sure. And this is an idea I had on vacation last week, so it's very poorly thought out so far. Nice. Is a Raspberry Pi controlled 3D printable drone with a Pi camera on it.
Cool.
Dave looks skeptical.
Go on. yes. I like it. It can be done. Latency is interesting.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Yeah, there are ways around that, but yeah.
I've got a bunch of the Pimoroni hats, so that's definitely a priority for me as well.
Awesome. Cool.
The unicorns.
I'm just going to jump in here. Somebody's asked an interesting question about Ubuntu on the 2 gig model with a Pi 4 2 gig model, and then asked whether the desktop can run on it. And somebody replied that the desktop won't work. It can work with a little tinkering. Don't expect great things from it, but yes, I did a blog post last month on playing around with the Ubuntu Hirsute desktop for a while and using ZSwap on it. And with a decent ZSwap setup, you can actually launch quite a few things, even on the 2 gig. It's not bad.
Interesting. Although it's probably worth saying as well, though, that while Ubuntu Desktop doesn't work on the 2 gigabyte Pi, Ubuntu Server and Ubuntu Core will work just fine.
Yeah.
So.
The desktop isn't officially supported on the 2 gig, but it will work, and with a little tinkering, you can actually make a quite decent experience out of it.
Nice. Okay, that's good. There's another question that I've seen in there that was going to be relevant to a bit later, so I'll skip over Martin's question for now, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah, okay, cool. So that's what's going to happen now. That's what we'd like to see happen. And I guess actually now we can just talk about that. So something that I want to push as a community team person, and something that I'm trying to push across Canonical, but also just generally within the Ubuntu community, is people doing things, people taking some initiative and not asking for permission, not waiting for things to happen, just doing things if they want to do them in support of Ubuntu, in support of these things. And one of the things, because of the Pi community is so large and the Ubuntu community is a lot of technical people and tinkerers in there, I'd really like to see more people doing Ubuntu things on Raspberry Pi, because of course I would. But one of the barriers to that right now is how people can get involved and how people can do these things for themselves and how people can contribute to these things. Now, I can tell you that we're working on sort of an onboarding process, a way for people to very easily do these things. But right now, Dave, I was wondering if you would be able to point people to places and talk a little bit about how you and William would like to have people helping out or contributing these things.
Right now, the biggest thing is testing. Using it as much as you can in as many different configurations as you can. So one of the big changes that we've had in the last couple of releases was moving away from U-boot. If you're using Focal, it's still using U-boot by default because long-term service, and we don't want to go messing with people's boot configs on something that has to be supported for that long. But Groovy was the first one we released that doesn't have U-boot on there by default if you installed from scratch. If you upgrade from Focal to Groovy, it will keep your U-boot intact. You can remove it fairly trivially. I need to write a proper blog post together. I wrote a hacky one a while back, and it's not great, but I need to write a better one about that. For Impish, I hope to strip out U-boot forcibly if it is still there. So for people who have upgraded Focal to Groovy to Hirsute to Impish, U-boot will be removed from the config if it's still there. Anyway, the reason I mention all this is that U-boot was the primary thing standing in the way of getting USB boot working. U-boot has USB drivers for the Pi's USB ports, but they didn't seem to work terribly well with the mass storage devices, and it took quite a long time for the USB 3 port to get supported on U-boot. Anyway, not a problem with Groovy onwards because U-boot isn't in the boot sequence. So we can do USB boot and indeed, theoretically at least, NetBoot in exactly the same way as Raspberry does. So if you're happy doing those things on Raspberry, please go and try them on Ubuntu. Let us know if you have any problems with that. Particularly different types of caddies, different types of drives. Very recently, NVMe drives have been supported for boot on the Compute Module 4. Theoretically, that is all supported on Ubuntu, on Hirsute, I think. I'm pretty sure Focal doesn't have the backport of the firmware there yet, but that's something I need to add before Focal's 0.3 release, so that can be supported there as well. So yeah, testing on as many different devices and boot devices as possible. There's probably not much point in testing HATs yet until we start getting some of those packages either upstream or into Ubuntu itself this cycle, but that would mean using the development release, which if you're happy doing that, great. Love to hear about testing on that, but I know most people are not terribly happy using development releases, so please go and try out GPIO stuff on Hirsute. We would love to know if the new GPIO layers work. If they don't, appropriate places to file bugs. Launchpad under the LGPIO project, if you're testing GPIO, or the GPIO 0 project. Again, on Launchpad, because this would be Ubuntu specific, best to report it on Launchpad before we figure out whether or not it's an upstream issue or not. For boot things, probably best to file bugs against Flash kernel on Launchpad. I think that's usually the particular culprit, because that's responsible for writing all the stuff to the boot partition. So any boot bugs should probably go into Flash kernel on Launchpad. And other than that, yeah, testing, whatever packages you can, everything you can, any hardware you can. Though, say, HAT's not necessarily worthwhile yet.
Coming up to this, I wanted to put together some kind of documentation for how people can do this, which we didn't get around to finishing. But in the next couple of weeks, we'll put out a blog post and some documentation somewhere as to, one, how you can do this testing, how you can do these bugs, and two, everything that Dave just said in one place, so you can look and see what's going on, and then we'll start preparing that and hopefully get some people around it. The specific question that you might have answered, and I didn't pick up that this was an answer to that question there, Dave. The specific question that Martin had was, is there any way that community people can help prepare HAT module packages for inclusion in Debian and or Ubuntu before then?
Yes, if there are packages existing in Raspbios, one of the things I'm currently going through is making sure that they are Debian ready. Debian tends to be considerably stricter than Raspbios about things like the copyright files and making sure that all the Debian packaging is up to the latest standards, the latest Deb helper compatibility levels, and all that sort of thing. If you're familiar with Debian packaging, please feel free to pick a HAT package that you happen to have, that you can work on, and see if you can work on it to get it up to Debian standards for upstreaming. That would be fantastic. Other than that, if you know that there are packages that have pip packages, for example, but not necessarily deb packages, it would be great to see if we can Debianize some of those as well. There's quite a few of those, and those might be a little trickier, especially if they pull in third-party dependencies. Again, it's not terribly difficult to do this simply, but to do it to the standard that Debian is going to require to get it upstream is a rather harder prospect. But yeah, well worth doing. Somebody's asked where they can get the Impish daily images. If you go to, well, actually, I'll see if I can get a couple of URLs pasted in here. I'll paste those separately.
Good idea. Yeah. For anyone who's watching this not live, hopefully by the time that you are watching this, I'll go back through this video and include as many links as I can. So the things that Dave's about to put in the chat, which if you can't find it, should be in the description, in the doobly-doo below. So you'll just be able to click on that instead. The other thing, so that's testing, that's packages. Of course, there's documentation and there's other things as well. And yeah, I'll do maybe it might be a wiki page. I'm not a huge fan of the wiki as it stands at the moment. There's some things that we need to improve, but it'll either be a wiki page or it'll be a discourse post, and it'll be a couple of blog posts to sort of have all of the information in one place. And then we'll turn it into some kind of official documentation down the road, because we're working on that sort of ecosystem and trying to put all that stuff in one place. The other thing that people can do, of course, is start thinking more about enabling their apps and developing apps on ARM itself, because there's a lot of problems in general around how a lot of the mainstream apps and a lot of apps just don't have very good ARM support. Right? Whether that's whatever packaging that is, whether that's snaps or not, it's a bit of an issue at the moment on Raspberry Pi platforms. And going into the future, when there's going to be more ARM hardware, more ARM desktops, and so on, the app ecosystem is a lot smaller than it is on I guess typical desktop environments. So it would be a really good way to contribute in general is to help port or to develop your apps in the beginning with proper ARM support. And then if you tell us about any of these things, if you talk to us about any of these things, we'll include them in videos, we'll promote them to the Ubuntu social channels and all this kind of thing, because I think it's really important that we get people enabled on the Raspberry Pi, if you will. Did you get that link there, Dave?
Yeah, we've got the Impish Server Dailies link up there. The Desktop Dailies link should be along shortly. just to address a couple of other comments that have come up. Somebody's asked about fixing video tearing and video acceleration. We do have video acceleration on the desktop since Groovy, and her suit obviously is on the Wayland desktop now, and that also has acceleration. Whether or not it's, do not expect the acceleration to be better or, for that matter, worse than Raspberry. Both teams, we have regular meetings now with the Pi Foundation team who work on the graphics stack, and we have a guy who also works on Mutter, which is part of the Wayland desktop stack, and they're now each working on various different components. But I wouldn't expect us to be any further ahead than Raspberry, other than on the basis of the release schedule being a little more common on Ubuntu. But both of us are both sides of this are working on towards the same goal.
Yep. There was a follow-up from Martin of if you put packages in a PPA to a good standard, is there a project on Debian Salsa to submit them?
Yes, the Debian Python project, assuming they're Python packages. The vast majority of HAT packages I'm aware of are generally Python packages, but yes, Debian Python, I've recently applied up there, and I should be able to help massage things along. Another question that I can probably just answer. Yes, why was U-Boot included with Focal? Largely because of the difficulty in migrating people away from it. We've got to deal with, it's not just a question of new images, but what do you do with people upgrading? And as I say, for people upgrading from Focal to Groovy, they're still sticking with U-Boot for now, because excising a fairly large chunk of people's boot configuration, which is user editable and frequently edited on the Pi, is a non-trivial thing. That is something that I'm hoping to address for Impish, and I've got a few reasonable ideas of how to do that using Pi boot control. But yes, that is largely the reason.
Cool, good. And then, of course, the other way people can get involved and help and so on is starting these kind of discussions over on Discourse, and Dave and I and William here can all jump in and discuss. And if you have any ideas, we can help you and so on and so forth. Cool, great. Well, we've been doing a pretty good job of answering questions as they come in. I don't think I've seen any that Dave didn't already just pick up. So is there anything else left to say? We don't have to stick on here for the whole hour. I think we're almost at 40 minutes here. I know we haven't got a chance to talk, William, about something that you put together before this. Do you want to say a little bit about the? Yeah. I
just got a 3D printer, and I'm like incredibly excited about it, and I had to move it into a different room because my wife said it was too loud. Because
I'm not at all jealous.
It's running like 24/7, so I had to move it out of the room. It's right behind the wall, but it's still kind of noisy. Anyway, so I designed a Raspberry Pi case with the Ubuntu logo on it. I will drop the link to Thingiverse. So credit where credit is due. This is a remix of another design that I added the Ubuntu logo to, and then modified a little bit to make sure it would work with hats. The original design wouldn't work if you had any kind of hat on your Pi. So there's a version that will work with hats, and then there's the original structured model that uses fewer standoffs. So I will get the link to that made up.
Awesome.
And I have a lot of Raspberry Pis, like a lot. Like probably not as many as Dave, but a lot more than most people. And they were like taking over my desk. Like I really try to have a nice clean desk area, and they just would show up like every day.
Do you think you have a problem yet?
At the end of the day, every day, I'm like, where did all these Raspberry Pis come from? So
are they breeding like tribbles yet?
I am working on a big old stackable cluster of them, essentially. So it's an arbitrarily stackable number of these. There's one model for the top and bottom, and then another model.
That's not a boyfriend.
So they'll mount up in the back like this. You can have 6 in each one, and then I'm going to make little custom mounts for things like the Compute Module 4 and the 3A that have different standoff dimensions. So this is going to be my next big thing I print after a mini ITX case, is finishing up this big old stack. And when that is done, I will put a how to do it description, step-by-step breakdown of all the parts you would need if you ever wanted to replicate this, and showing how it's assembled. I'm going to put that up on my blog when it's all finished. But it's got, probably another few days of printing, because that's a lot of filament.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of filament. Okay, just quickly then. So I'll wrap up in a second, but just quickly, Daniel had a question that maybe clarifies the question before.
Why was U-boot used at all? That is an excellent question. Not one I can definitively answer, simply because it's before my time, but I can take a guess. U-boot is used upstream by Debian as their default for booting pretty much any single board computer, and indeed the Raspberry Pi as well. So my guess would simply be that it was included because that's what Debian did. And to be honest, that's not a terrible way of going about things. It turned out to be because the Pi is a very special snowflake when it comes to booting. It's very, very different from almost any other single board computer in that sense. But from the point of view of trying to make an image or trying to make multiple images for as many single board computers as you can, U-boot's not a bad way to go. It's a good project. It's well run. It has very wide-ranging support for lots and lots of hardware. Unfortunately, it does make a few assumptions that don't work terribly well on Pi, especially with the way, I'm casting no aspersions here, but for example, Raspbios decided that the way to handle the Pi 4 upgrade, very sensibly, was say, take your SD card, shove it in your existing Pi 3, 3 Plus, whatever, do your full apt upgrade cycle there, shove that in your Pi 4, job's a good one, it'll boot. But if you think about it, that means you're taking the storage from one machine and moving it to another. And this is common and a very common use case on the Pi generally. A lot of people develop on a larger Pi, like a Pi 4, and then deploy on something like a Pi 0. Perfectly reasonable use case. But a lot of single-board computers don't have storage that goes walkies. They have embedded storage soldered onto the board that does not go walkies. And U-boot does make certain assumptions about your storage not going walkies. So, for example, in the U-boot environment, it tends to write the USB Ethernet address and serial number. So these are cached in the environment and then overwritten by U-boot on the next boot. This caused some considerable fun for a customer that wound up with 48 Pis with the same MAC address. Not good. Yeah, I cannot definitively answer why U-boot was there, but my guess would be because that's what Debian did, and therefore that's what Ubuntu wound up doing. But yeah, so as I say, it's not necessarily the best fit, and so this is the reason we've moved away from it.
Cool. All right, great. So as I say, I think we'll start. I'll wrap up a little bit here. Is there anything else either of you wanted to say, or anything you wanted to broadcast a little bit here? Just shake your heads if not.
No, not that I can think of. No, other than please go check out GPIO on Hadoop.
Please check out Kick Some Tires.
It works.
We'll publish some.
We've done a lot of testing, but we can't test everything.
Exactly. Indeed. So if people do that, let us know, and we'll also be publishing some things to help people along the way. So thank you for everyone who stuck around for the whole stream. Thank you for people who've joined part of the way through. For anyone interested in getting more involved, you can, if you didn't hear, you can either go back, or the recording of this will be up later today, so you'll be able to rewatch it again, because I know everyone will want to. And of course, if you have any more questions or you want to continue the discussion, the link to the discourse post about this will be over there. So, and Dave and Will and I will all be in there ready to chat. And if you're interested in hearing more about Ubuntu on Air and all of these things, there's the next scheduled programming for Ubuntu on Air is on Thursday, where the community team, where myself and Monica will be back to talk about just general community things and take questions and talk around some things. Speaking of Monica has been moderating the chat. I'm sure everyone has noticed in there. So just a quick big thank you to Monica for helping us out with the stream. She's been wonderful. That's all I have note-wise. So thank you both for joining me. I hope you enjoyed yourselves in some way. And thanks everyone for turning up. All right. Goodbye.
Bye bye.